the woman who brought down a Chief Justice. Picture this. A single woman walks into a room filled with the most powerful people in America, carrying nothing but a binder and the truth. Within minutes, she would destroy the career of the nation's highest judge and expose a corruption network that had been hidden for decades. This is the story of Jasmine Crockett versus Chief Justice John Roberts, and it's more shocking than any Hollywood thriller. The setup: the marble floors of the Capitol hearing chamber gleamed under harsh lights as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped through the doors. She was there for what should have been a routine budget hearing about a $3.1 billion infrastructure shortfall. But the moment she entered, she knew something was wrong. The room was packed wall-to-wall with lobbyists, federal contractors, and conservative senators. And sitting at the center of it all, presiding over what should have been a simple fiscal inquiry, was an unprecedented figure: Chief Justice John Roberts himself. The Supreme Court never interfered in budget hearings, unless someone was a threat. And to Roberts, Jasmine Crockett was exactly that. The first strike. The second Jasmine began to speak, Roberts cut her off like a guillotine. "Let's spare us emotional rhetoric," he said, his voice flat but sharp. "I trust you brought more than just moral outrage this time, Congresswoman." Laughter hissed from the gallery behind him. It was clear this wasn't just a hearing. It was a public execution designed to humiliate her before she could speak. But they had made one fatal mistake, assuming she had come unprepared. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stepped forward, placed her binder on the table with surgical precision, and opened it with deliberate calm. The total congressional authorization for the National Infrastructure Expansion Act was $3.1 billion, she stated, her voice steady as steel. She slid the first document onto the projection screen. Then she reached deeper into the binder and pulled out her real weapon, an internal ledger marked confidential, bearing the logo of Stratus Core Industries. "But according to this," she continued, her finger tracing the damning numbers, "their actual expenditures ballooned to over $6 billion. Nearly double. No congressional approval, no secondary authorization, no explanation." The murmurs in the room began to shift from amusement to unease. Roberts still hadn't said a word. Somewhere, Jasmine locked eyes with him. $2.9 billion slipped through the cracks. 16 shell companies were created in less than 10 days, all tied to the same 3 addresses in Delaware. Each moved funds offshore within 48 hours of receiving federal transfers. Then came her knockout punch. And here's the kicker. 5 of those companies share a compliance auditor who also sits on the Chief Justice's private advisory board. Her finger pointed directly at Roberts. That's not coincidence. That's architecture. The counterattack, the silence that followed was deafening. Roberts, who had maintained his usual arrogant detachment, finally moved to shut her down. His tone turned sharp, paternal, dripping with the kind of arrogance that only years of unchecked authority can build. "You can read numbers from whatever documents you please, Congresswoman," he said, every syllable coated in disdain. "But let's be clear, this isn't your courtroom." It was meant to enter momentum with one clean, belittling blow. A few murmurs of agreement stirred from the back, but Jasmine didn't rise to it. She didn't need to. Instead, she quietly lifted the next document from her binder and placed it beneath the projector. The image bloomed on the screen with clinical clarity. "This isn't about whose courtroom it is," she said, her voice low and controlled. "It's about who signed off on a financial maneuver that no oversight committee ever saw." There was a federal authorization request stamped with clearance and bearing one devastating line at the bottom: J. Roberts, signed in clean, deliberate ink with the title Honorary Advisory Chair, Federal Interagency Budget Acceleration Committee. The silence was immediate and total. For the first time, Chief Justice John Roberts was no longer above the facts she had just laid bare, the audio bombshell. But Jasmine wasn't done. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black recorder. Placing it on the evidence table, she never took her eyes off Roberts. "With the court's permission," she said, "I'd like to play an audio excerpt tied directly to these discrepancies." Roberts gestured dismissively, believing nothing could touch him. Then Jasmine pressed play. A crackle of static, followed by a man's voice, calm, confident, dangerously casual. "Just delete the ledgers." No one's coming after Roberts. The words hit like a slow-motion collision. The voice belonged to Martin Cleary, Deputy Chief Financial Officer of Stratus Core Holdings. And the Roberts he was referring to was the man seated at the head of the bench. Roberts shot up too quickly, his spine locked, jaw clenched. The recording has no legal standing. It's inadmissible, but the tremor behind his words betrayed him. It wasn't just a protest of a jurist. It was the recoil of someone who realized the walls might not hold. The systematic destruction. Jasmine moved methodically like a surgeon. She presented document after document. Offshore accounts, shell companies, development permits signed by Roberts in his consulting capacity, financial trails that all led back to one man. She showed the room a complex flowchart of how taxpayer money was laundered through multiple layers of fake companies, eventually ending up in Roberts' private trust accounts. Every signature was verified. Every transaction was documented. "This isn't poor oversight," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This is design. This is architecture. This is the quiet laundering of influence beneath the cloak of legal process." The final slide appeared. Scanned development permits approved weeks before funding was even released, all bearing Roberts' elegant signature. Chief Justice Roberts signed 3 of these permits in a personal capacity, resulting in over $400 million in redirected contracts, Jasmine stated. "Your name is on all of them." Roberts didn't speak. He shifted in his seat like a man pinned beneath the weight of exposure. Not by angry rhetoric, but by paperwork, by receipts, by trails he thought would never be followed. The explosion. Cornered and desperate, Roberts finally exploded. He shot up from his seat, voice booming, face taut with fury. "This is politically motivated slander," he shouted, his palm slapping the bench with such force it echoed like a dropped gavel. An orchestrated spectacle meant to discredit this court. The words came fast and loud, not to persuade the room, but to reclaim it. But they didn't land as conviction. They landed as panic. He scanned the room, searching for nods of loyalty, but found none. The senators had gone rigid. The aides weren't writing. Even the reporters sat frozen. Jasmine remained anchored, unshaken. When he stopped shouting, she let the silence hold, then spoke softly but firmly. "It's not slander if it's backed by evidence. And if justice is truly blind, then it does not see power. It does not see robes. It does not see titles. It only sees truth." The final revelation. But Jasmine had saved the most devastating evidence for last. She pulled out a thick file stamped Federal Judicial Ethics Committee, confidential correspondence. "Since we're speaking of legitimacy," she said, "perhaps the court should be reminded of what's been quietly buried beneath it." The screen lit up with internal reports from the Judicial Ethics Oversight Commission. 3 separate complaints spanning 7 years, all alleging conflict of interest involving Chief Justice Roberts. Each complaint had passed the preliminary threshold for review, yet all were closed quietly without explanation. The final document was a closing memo with one handwritten line. "No further action recommended. Optics risk is too high." Not legal reasoning. Not exoneration. Just fear of headlines. Justice arrives. As Jasmine's final words echoed across the chamber, 3 figures appeared at the back of the room, moving down the center aisle with practiced efficiency. Dark suits, unreadable expressions, every step calibrated with federal authority. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice measured and unwavering. "Chief Justice John Roberts, you are now the subject of federal investigation. We are executing a lawful warrant to seize all devices, communications records, and physical materials related to financial disclosures under inquiry." The courtroom didn't gasp or erupt. It froze in complete stillness. Roberts remained seated at first, stunned not by the sound of the agent's voice, but by what it represented. The collapse of the illusion that had shielded him for decades. For the first time in his carefully guarded tenure, he was no longer the arbiter. He was the subject. With stiffness born from pride, he rose and stepped down from the elevated platform, not with command of the judge, but with the weight of a man trying not to stumble beneath his own undoing. He turned toward the private exit, the door that for years had led him out of scrutiny. But he never reached it. The second agent stepped into his path, extending a hand, not forceful but final. Roberts halted, his shoulders sagging as a realization hit. There was no ground beneath him anymore. The aftermath. Within hours, the clip of Roberts' downfall had exploded across the internet. By midnight, it had crossed 12 million views. The hashtags #JusticeUnrobed and #Crockett vs. Roberts dominated every platform. But Jasmine didn't stop at exposure. She built something permanent. Truth Bench, an independent investigative body with real teeth, designed to trace the money behind every robe. Within 72 hours, she had launched federal judicial transparency legislation and partnerships with oversight agencies. The response was immediate. Judges across the country quietly began revising their financial disclosures. Some removed ambiguous trusts. Others suddenly disclosed gifts they had forgotten. A handful stepped down altogether. But the real revelation came when anonymous sources leaked documents revealing Archstone, a 30-year coordinated network spanning judicial and political institutions. Roberts wasn't the architect. He was just one polished node in a chain of corruption that ran far deeper than anyone imagined. Shell companies, nonprofit fronts, advisory boards. It was an ecosystem designed to protect the powerful and punish anyone who questioned it. The legacy. Standing on the steps of Philadelphia's old courthouse, Jasmine addressed the largest crowd she had ever faced. No security fanfare, no entourage, just one woman who had dared to speak when everyone else chose silence. For too long, she said, we have been told that trust in our institutions must be maintained at all costs, even if that cost is truth. But trust cannot be maintained through secrets. It must be earned in daylight. When a reporter asked if she was afraid, she answered with force that stunned even the most cynical voices. Fear keeps people quiet. I choose to speak. The lesson. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose corruption. She reminded us who justice belongs to. Not the robe, not the title, not the bench. Us. She proved that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it holds its ground. Sometimes it walks into a room of power armed with nothing but truth and refuses to be silenced. The greatest injustice isn't a corrupt decision. It's the silence that follows it. But when one person chooses to act, to speak, to drag the truth into the light, everything changes. Because justice doesn't trickle down from the Supreme Court. It rises from people like Jasmine Crockett who refuse to accept that silence equals civility, who demand transparency not as a favor but as a right. She cracked open the walls of power so the rest of us could see what's been rotting behind them. And once you've seen it, you don't get to look away. The question now isn't what Jasmine Crockett did. The question is, what will you do with the truth she revealed? Because courage is contagious. And this country can't afford to let the next truth teller stand alone.